Good evening and welcome to H675. I will continue with the book by Ashish Dalila. And I just want to say that it was a rather breakthrough for me because I had some troubles before with philosophical investigations. While I didn't know I had the troubles, but I realized there were some troubles. And I want to mention the problem is everything is down to didactics. Where is the reader situated? It's something that we usually ignore in Western philosophy, even Western education. For a knowledge to fit into the person, it has to be modeled as the person will perceive it. And I think it's this idea of knowledge that's been so, what can you say, generalized and universalized. So we teach everything in the same way and we think we can learn in the same way. But then we're forgetting the subject. It's more like this. If we think about the subject like a cogwheel, the knowledge has to fit into that cogwheel when we are taking in the subject. So you see here, the idea of a generalized subject, an origo or whatever has had an effect on education as well. Because we think there is a general subject, we think the receiver is always the same, and therefore the knowledge can always be the same. Isn't that interesting? And I think not many people have been thinking about that as much as Wittgenstein. But he missed out on a point, which is, in a way, it's completely, how can you say?
Understandable.
Yeah, in a way, yeah, it's. He couldn't really have done it another way. Nobody else has been written about these things. But there is a general idea here that the subject doesn't matter. But if the subjects matter, if we are going to follow quantum mechanics or the insight from quantum mechanics, we need to think in terms of the subject, and the subject is always different levels. So the understanding has to fit the subject. When the subject and the knowledge fits, first then you have knowledge. If it doesn't fit, you don't have knowledge at all. So there is no knowledge in itself. It's only when it fits the receiver you have knowledge. So it's a very radical revisionistic view of knowledge and understanding and education. Whereas, we can compare the two Wittgensteins, the earlier one and the later one. The earlier one obviously thought every knowledge was the same and it didn't matter who received it. It was like easily packaged, universalized, fitting everyone, but at the same time no one. And this is very similar to the left hemisphere thinking, actually. Ian McGilchrist said, when we started to humanly devise religion, change it according to human mind, or the fashion for the epoch, as we started in the 16th century, with the different changes, man-mind changes. We try to do manly things that originated from human beings. I think Calvin named that, it's no religion if it's not man-made, need to be made by man. I think at that time people already didn't have an understanding that there could be such a thing as a god, and therefore they constructed a man-made religion to better serve the purpose. But they still had some sort of deity, and I think that deity was the universalist idea, everything was the same. And one thing that Ian McGilchrist pointed out, when we took away the holy places and said everywhere is holy, nowhere was holy in the end. I didn't even have a holy place. And it's the same with the generalized knowledge. And generalized knowledge is no knowledge for anyone. Well, there could actually be an exception. That generalized knowledge could be fitting maybe one or two people who happen to be on the same level, whose cogs are just like the generalized knowledge. But that has to be in a specific area, very, very narrow. This could happen. It could happen, yeah. But it becomes a knowledge for no one. And I think about how it used to be when you learn something. My subject used to be Renaissance painting. And you never started in a generalized school. You started as a disciple, an apprentice. And all the teaching was directed towards you, your level. It was direct learning. You had the master there. And you developed according to a scheme that was firmly established. But the knowledge itself was determined by the master or the guild of masters. And then you got your diploma after doing practical tests. And that changed. We got the generalized knowledge, and I don't think it was caused by the educational system as such. It was caused by these ideas of taking away the subject, getting rid of the subject. It has some costs. But I am digressing here a bit, so you might forget what I just said, but this is going to serve as an introduction to another way of thinking that helped me a lot. But that is not the subject of tonight. I will take up Ashish Dalela's variety of the Vedic approach to the world, language, semantics. You have it. And he calls it a linguistic theory of nature. And as I said in 674, he doesn't mean linguistic as a school term or a subject. It's more to do with language. It generally looks like this. Word is transported to meaning as transported to object. This is not a reference. It's not the arrow that you see in philosophy. This is an actual force. It's a force. Usually when we see arrows, we study linguistics or something similar, those arrows don't symbolize a force, just symbolize reference of some sort. But in the Vedic vision, it's an actual force. Not just reference. Something that happens with another thing, but that's caused by a physical force of some sort. Albeit very light, but it's still a force. This is similar to Wittgenstein. I should stop talking about Wittgenstein soon. But it's similar in that aspect that everything is real. Words are as real as objects, are on the same level. Because in between words, a meaning to objects is not referential. It's forces, actual forces that do things. They create meaning or push meaning to the forefront. So as you hear, it's a rather different approach. But it's a bit similar that we started before. In quantum physics, there were people who said that thoughts are actually material. That's why you can observe them, and that's also the reason they have an effect. Things needs to be material to have an effect. Or to have an effect is something that material things has. Point proven. They do things. And I realize more and more that Wittgenstein's approach is to show that all relationship, all the forces, everything connected with causality, effect, consequences, they are all part of the world on equal levels. And it's this approach that Ashish does is somewhat dissimilar, but there's also have similarities to Wittgenstein. But one thing that's unique is that the idea of dissolving the mind-body problem is something that at the beginning looks fairly complicated. It looks even that he adds complexion. And I think that's typical for the Vedic approach. It looks more complicated in the beginning. It looks like you're actually adding categories when you should get rid of categories. And that was the idea I had in the beginning. We studied this 2 years ago down in Hisingen, an island outside Gothenburg. I think it was Christmas. And I was thinking to myself, he's actually adding complexity. Whereas Wittgenstein, I have the feeling, is taking away complexity. When he, for instance, says that word and world are the same thing. I think those things are actually amounting to exactly, well, more or less the same thing. To say and to mean that there's nothing underneath or above that take precedence. And that is always the case with Western thinking in general terms. I mentioned before, when we speak about intention or meaning, that is supposed to have a higher level of reality than all the other words, has a special position, godlike position. And you can have a whole book written that describes meaning of words. That's not okay. That's definitely not okay. It's like it should be some sub-language or some meta-language. Who constructed it? Nobody tells you. It was never constructed, or it was constructed ex nihilo. And where does it exist? Who are using this meta-language in which you can describe the meanings of all the words? It's complete ludicrous. It's complete nonsense. It doesn't really get weirder or anything more strange than that. It's like saying that the word candle can explain all other words in the language. And you can use candle as an expression, and you have a big book that you say, maybe a cow is like 50 candles, 50 and a half candles, and those candles are mostly red. It's such a nonsense to say that you can say the meaning of all words, and you can describe that meaning. Ashish Dalela says that actually is demented to think such a thing. It's demented. It's not a small mistake, it's a gigantic mistake. And you are actually demented in a way if you think that. Because nobody is using language that way. Nobody on this earth, nobody in some supposed earth of those who has this idea of the multiple universe, like Hugh Everett. No, this is completely nonsense. And it's much weirder than we usually suppose it is. It's horribly weird. It's an incredible mistake. And actually, to categorize everything in candles makes a whole lot more sense than saying every word has a meaning and you can define it. Because this could be a possible way of describing language. Very impractical, it wouldn't do much yield. Whereas the word meaning, it has a specific purpose in language and is never to explain all the words. That was something that started somewhere in the 16th century, 15th century. It's ludicrous. It's sick, even, I would say. It's a horrible misuse of language. There should be some punishment against it. Let's instead be sound and safe. Let's think about things that actually make some sort of sense. And things that actually is something we're already using. Let's not invent a meta language that happened. Yes, it possibly happened 300-400 years ago and it developed, but it's still impossible. There were no such meta language. There are not dwarves living underneath this roof constructing that language. No, try another thing. Ashish Dalela said, let's use the words we're already using for mind and body. Let's not invent a new language. And the invention of a new language has historical roots. It started somewhere in the 18th century. We started to talk about the body in a different way than we used to. And there the problem started somewhere. Language has a purpose. Language is something to be preserved. Language should not be mishandled by constructing meta-language, but it should not either be changed in a way to form to fit a format that it has nothing to do with language, like technology. So his wish is, let's go back to where we still had a sound and good use of language. And those words we're using for the mind, let's continue to use those. Maybe some of those words are today discarded, like the soul or spirit or stamina, I don't know, different things. Consciousness. Consciousness was actually something that was redefined by a person like Daniel Dennett. It's a pile of nonsense, that what he's saying. Consciousness has a use and it corresponds to something. Let's stop there. Let's not dwell on those things anymore. Let's not make up that one part of the language, for instance, candles. I think he doesn't use candles, he uses atoms. He says consciousness is made out of atoms. It has the same level of nonsense as saying a cat is made up of dices or carrots. It's a misuse of language to say that. Horrible misuse. And he gets away with it. He should at least have a fine. He should not be able to go to bed having his milk and cookie. It should be derived on the milk and cookie. And I think he's sort of a chubby guy, so he deserves it until he loses some weight. No, it's a horrible misuse of language, and oddly enough, from a culture that is so divergent from the Western culture as the Indian. And this specific viewpoint, Vedic, the Vedic one, tells us all of a sudden use language as you always have. And that language is powerful, it has meaning, and it can express things. It has an expression of power. And I think the inherent meaning is don't destroy language. Don't kill the meaning in language by believing in meta-language or the prioritizing of different words. Meaning or intention is not the only one. Another one is truth. and something that De Bono wrote about. In some certain senses you can say something is true. I saw a fox the other day is actually true. Somebody doubts me. But to say it is true that Hans saw a fox the other day and make a proposition of it, it's already a sort of nonsense. Nobody talks that way. Why should I? Why should you? Why should anyone? And what would that prove? Nothing. It's ludicrous. No, he actually appeals, oddly enough, from a Vedic perspective. Westerners, take care of your language. Use it in the way it was working from the beginning. And that's also something that gets support from connectivism. We spoke about connectivism the other day, and that's the idea that language has its own power. It's a web taking its model from the World Wide Web, but it's surprisingly accurate. And from the whole web comes the power of each word. And I think that's a very good way of describing the language game. The power of language comes from its use, and its use is all its connections. In every purpose it's been used. It's including temporality, before, after, causality, and all the rest, excluding nothing. Nothing excluded. And oddly enough, if we follow this path to the end, we get rid of the observer problem. What role does the observer play? And all of a sudden, all those ideas become embarrassingly simple. An observer is an observer. Use ordinary language. In ordinary language, an observer does actually do this marvelous thing by collapsing the wave function or the superposition. This is what happened in ordinary language. Imagine a scene, 3 people are sitting at a table drinking a glass of beer, and somebody comes in and says, it's a pack of wolves outside, let's defend ourselves. That's bound to cause a lot of locomotion inside the place, get people agitated, active, and do stuff. That was the collapse of the wave function. It happened because an observation was made. So we already have the collapse of the wave function in ordinary language. It's just when we start to analyze it with this meta language, or a really weird way of using the word truth, and so on and so on. And of course, existence. Overuse of the word existence makes the whole language game go hayward. It corrupts it, and it gives the feeling, you can't even draw this, but it gives the feeling that for some reason existence is in the middle of the language game, and everything is circling around this existence, the essence. Of course it's not like this. It can never be like that. You shouldn't even take a photo of it. Because it can never be like that. You should never draw an illusion that could actually make the illusion stronger. But in effect, it's the perception among the people who think that essence or existence take precedence. Maybe in some way they're thinking that could be the case, but it's not the case. The change of the word "estein" in Greek was a corruption of the Greek language. It was a destruction of the Greek language. And it made many Greek people, maybe not so many in the beginning, but more and more people misusing language. not knowing what they were saying, and the person listening didn't understand what they were saying. There's a double effect. You don't understand what you're saying to another person when you use the word existence. The other one is not understanding what you're saying. And that double effect caught on in Greek antiquity, and then it got stronger and stronger. And of course, to explain what existence is for these people in their heads makes the problem even greater, because that is bound to build up the illusion it's possible to think about existence, and that existence is actually a thing. I think this is very similar to an interview so many years ago on television. They were interviewing a person who was suffering from schizophrenia. And the person, it was a woman, very eloquent, well educated. And she said, I see things all the time and I hear them. And the interviewer, do you see things now? And she said, yes, I do. What do you see? And then she said, if I start talking about the things I see around me now, that's going to make things worse for me in weeks to come or months to come. It makes it much worse to acknowledge that I'm seeing things. So I will not mention what I see. And I think it's the same thing with all these discussions about existence. It sharpens, it enhances, it founds in some ways the idea that existence actually is a possibility, that the hallucination is a little bit more than a hallucination, that it at least has some reality to it. I have to quote Paul Feyerabend here. He said, not even wrong. It's something that cannot be wrong. It's not even wrong. It's much worse than that. It's similar to hallucinations, but it's not the same thing. And I think, and this is a quote from Wittgenstein himself, when you realize how big an error it is to assume existence, you will be shocked by your own mistakes, more shocked than of anything you ever done in your life, unconsciously or consciously. So it's a big mistake. It's big enough to linger on with us. And it is a problem you need to walk really careful around, because every attempt to attack it can make it stronger. By then you make it real. It's a little bit like fighting in the dark against imagined demons. The more you fight, the more real they become. But still we have to do something. So which approach is the best? Is it the Wittgensteinian that asks so much from you and is not putting you on a level that's designed for you? He had never thought, where are the readers situated? Yes, of course, the book was published in the early 50s, if I don't misnow myself. So that was even a different world, but not even for the people of the 1950s it was designed. Ashish Dalela had a more regulated view. He takes it from the Vedic tradition. He conforms it a little bit to modern thinking, and then he puts it in the context that's understandable for us, modern science, modern philosophical problems. And Wittgenstein could have said he made an error because he makes things too clear. I don't think it's an error. I think it's a pedagogical tool. It might be wrong, but it have to be wrong. The cogs have to fit. A grammatically correct rule when you're studying language in the beginning is disastrous. It won't help you. You need a rule you can understand from the perspective of your level and what language you're talking, not something you cannot understand. That's the taking away the subject. The subject needs to be in the equation. What can you understand? There's no use speaking Chinese to somebody whose mother tongue is Bulgarian, for instance. In the same way, we need to understand who is the receiver, who is the giver. There's two important things. Ashish Darela puts it like this: when you are ready, you could start using the same language for mind and body. You don't use a specific technical parlance when you speak about the body, to say it's consisting of atoms or blood cells, blood clots, ligaments or whatever. And when you start that, the mind will then perceive sensations or concepts like red, because the world is a symbol of redness. Note I said world, not word. As this view of mind is extended, more properties in the mind, such as judgment, intentions, and morals, will also have counterparts in science. This approach is therefore scientifically very fruitful, because it identifies new properties in matter that cannot be seen from the current physical viewpoint about nature. These properties can in turn lead us to new theories and experiments. It sounds a bit high-winded, but I don't think it is, because language was from the beginning cause of science. That was from there science developed. And by taking language in, we can make science much richer, instead of having this impoverished language. A language that's not able to describe things, not able to describe what is meaning in a word. It's not able to describe what is the consistency of the body, and not even mind, I'll say. There is a much later trend when even the mind gets corrupted by new expressions. We start talking about things we never talked about before. Influenced, of course, by this impoverished scientific parlance or verbiage. So it's a very sound theory, and I think it corresponds a little bit that this impoverished language, it gets some authority, and therefore there are people who wanted to go in that trail, or that career, or whatever you can call it. I think Torbjörn Törnsjö is a good example. When he wants to provoke people, he tries to sound even more scientifically, or scientific elite, or something like that. Similarity to scientific. And he tried to not use emotion, not use morale, because those are illegit in this scientific language, he thinks. Do you see the game he's playing? He tried to sound like somebody who's using a microscope and try to look at a microbe or some chemical substance. And in that specific 400 case, words like I don't like it or morale is not in good place. And then we are transporting that language to other areas, because it has gained some authority and demeanor and prestige, authority, and he tries to use that to sound more intelligent than he is, or getting more authority than he should, actually, I'd say. And if some people point at me and say, it can't be that simple, yeah, I think it actually is. I think he's just corrupting language and he's making a profit on it. He doesn't have any substance whatsoever to what he's saying. And when people understand that, everything he says, well, it will remain nonsense. It always was nonsense and it will remain nonsense. But it will fall to the ground for the other people who believes in him. I think it's just the opposite from this quote from, is it from the Bible? I don't know. But the greatest illusion that the devil could do is pretend, make believe people he doesn't exist, something like that. And maybe it's a literary quote. But here's just the opposite. Here's a person or persons, groups, a whole class of people who are trying to pretend they are the devil. But they're not. They're nothing. They're speaking in a way that doesn't even make sense. But it sounds somewhat similar to science. That's all what it is to it. But of course, we cannot use only pinpointing. We need rules how to get back to sound language use. And that's the Vedic point of view. So the solution, as always, comes from the East. And the East can even make us heal our language and our world. His first thing to heal here is actually the mind-body problem. But I realized he could actually heal language because language is endangered today. It's not just the environment, it's our language. And I'd say our language has been under attack the last 300-400 years. People are destroying it. Not intentionally, of course, but they are making a profit of it, trying to make weird points, trying to get famous. Richard Dawkins is another example. I don't know what he's saying. It never made any sense. It doesn't make any sense even to other scientists. But some people still react to him somehow and find his nonsense, his platitude profound. And I think that profoundness never ever comes from what he's actually saying. It's because it sounds so damn similar to science. And Ashish Dalila's solution is not only to heal language, but to heal science at the same time. To show that science is coming from ordinary language, normal language, and all its meaning comes from ordinary language. And somehow a lot of the bits of language disappeared. And Ashish Dalila, rather clumsily, but it needs to be clumsy in the beginning. It cannot be precise. He pushes, he says, let's put judgment into science once more. Let's put morale into science once more. Let's put emotions into science once more. And then we will have a science that is much closer to what science actually always been in a way. Something that has blood, something that has a body, that has a personality, and it has people striving to do scientific discoveries. They are flesh and bone. Exactly, oddly, exactly the point as Paul Feyerabend. Science is still to this day practice. It's not something transcendental, completely abstract, only describable ex posteriori from some weird viewpoint. up in the air. No, it's something practical. I think CERN in Switzerland has something in the vicinity of 2,000-3,000 people working, and they're not all composing abstract theory that has no connection to the world. That is actually the job of only maybe 10-20 people. The rest are actually using tools to adjust CERN, polish CERN, being inside CERN when it's shut off, of course, because it's highly dangerous to be inside CERN when it's on. And they do instrumental adjustments. They do whatever. They use their hands. They walk about and do this. And some people will be shocked to say, oh no, that is nothing special. Yes, that's why it's so special. Because we are the most advanced thing in the universe. There's no computer instrument that could be more advanced than human beings. I think that's obvious. Otherwise we would have artificial intelligence by now. There'd be robots outside here roaming about looking for, I don't know, or seeds or something like that. Of course we're more advanced than all the machinery. And of course human beings need to be at CERN to fix the Higgs boson or something like that. They can't be done by the machines. They're not as advanced as human beings, still to this day. So isn't it obvious that it's a practical thing? It's not coming from nowhere. And it's rather amazing. But what Ashish tried to show us, that illusion is partly caused by our personal confusion about language. And that can be fixed. And all of a sudden we can easily understand why all scientific practice is practice. There is nothing wrong with that. That's what makes it so advanced. Nobody would say that I can't listen to Bach anymore because I realized all his concerts, all his arias, it was produced by human beings. I can't listen to it anymore. It's not fancy enough. I thought it was made by a mechanical device in the 17th century. A clock or something made it. There's something ludicrous lurking about here. It's absolutely silly. We think for some reason machines are more advanced than human beings. Who makes the machines? That's a question to figure out. I should end here. Until next time, figure this out. Who makes the machines? Just go figure. And I say thank you and wish you all a very good night.